The world is really dangerous. Truly, almost everyone on this planet would rip your head off for a hamburger, especially the IRS, FBI, and the government as a whole. But you know what's the most vicious of these forces? Drug cartels. These forces would mess you up. Sure, you should not expect to live if a dictator wants you dead, but if a drug lord wants you to die, you just better bury yourself. This is just part of how powerful cartels are. And two of the most powerful drug lords in the world were Pablo Escobar and El Chapo. If they had a battle of glory, who would win? Find out in the latest episode of BigFactz, Pablo Escobar versus El Chapo. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notifications button. Unsurprisingly, both these drug pins were really cruel. And we're not talking about the normal, no mercy for enemies cruel. They weren't even merciful to their friends. They could gift you a house 1 second, and the next second cut off your head to get your tie for a meeting. They were cold, calculating, and ruthless, and they actually have many similarities in their cruel ways. Some incidents highlight these similarities. On the other very similar hand, Pablo Escobar had ordered the murder of not one, not even three, but 3,000 people through a single hitman, who was also awful, but we'll get to him later on. Once he heard about a woman who had died due to the mistake of the bus driver. He immediately got the driver killed, and he did it without remorse. As for the other cartel leader, in the 1980s and 90s, Miguel Martinez was El Chapo's right-hand man. Actually, Miguel testified during the El Chapo trials that he had become a loyal servant of the kingpin. He helped the man with massive shipments of drugs flown in from Colombia that made his boss a fortune. But their relationship ran beyond professional grounds. They were friends, and the two became so close that El Chapo was his son's mentor. Now, being one of the world's biggest drug lords, right-hand man had many privileges. But before you only listen to the privileges and run away to become a drug lord's pal, keep listening to hear Miguel's tragic end. So one day, Miguel had a fleet of private jets, beach houses all over Mexico, and a Tiger King-style zoo, only better. The next day, El Chapo suspected him of snitching, and Miguel was slapped with 3 assassination attempts. Miguel told the press that, after El Chapo landed in prison, he tried to look after his friend's family still, and even gave the legal fees. This was before El Chapo betrayed him again and got him arrested. Then came the behind-the-bars nightmare. In the first jail in Mexico City where he was locked up, he was cornered in his cell by other prisoners and stabbed an upward of 15 to 20 times. After his release from the hospital, El Chapo made sure that he was returned to the very same cell and with the same cellmates. That night, Miguel heard them polish their knives and blades. Of course, after that, he was hit by another attack before he was moved to another jail. There was a peculiar interest there over the size of his shoes. He wasn't stupid. He knew it meant that there was a bounty on his head. Anyone who killed him would get a great amount of money from the cartel. He was stabbed again while making a phone call, treated again, and put in solitary confinement for his protection. So Miguel ended up in private custody where El Chapo had his favorite song sung before throwing a literal grenade into his cell. Miguel survived to testify, but you might not be so lucky. So don't do drugs, folks, and especially don't sell them. The basic point is that no creature is scarier than a creature without sanity. And you might have figured out that these stories, that these two particular model human beings, were as insane as bats. But who was insanier? Let's move on to the comparison, starting with their early lives. Starting with El Chapo, he does have a tragic early life story. Don't have too much sympathy for him. He turns out to be as awful as, well, Pablo Escobar, whose story is similar but drastically different at the same time. El Chapo was born in Sinaloa in a dirt-poor family. His father was also a cattle rancher, but spent his money on booze and women, leaving the family to fend for himself. Nothing too different. Of course, it is a tragedy, but most families in Sinaloa live like that, trying to forget that they existed. But this frustrated El Chapo to no end. He dropped out in the 3rd grade to sell fruits and trinkets to earn some money, and soon enough replaced trinkets with drugs. A lot of drugs. Never say that El Chapo abandoned his former roots. At 15, El Chapo was already teamed up with his cousins to plant and then sell marijuana. The next one, Pablo Escobar, was born in the city of Medellin in Colombia. His father and mother both worked hard as a rancher and a schoolteacher. They were both stable and even affectionate. But we bet they had no idea that their little boy would be killing sooner than they could say, "What's the beat-up man doing in your room, Pablo?" His family was pretty well off, and the neighborhood was okay, but the whole city was heavily influenced by drugs. We mean you didn't have to take part in it, but also you'd be set for life if you did. So you technically did have to do drugs. The real trouble began when Pablo's father sold his farm and moved everyone to a nearby village because the village was even worse than the city. Surprisingly, here Pablo got involved in some good and some bad activities. Good ones included wealth and class difference eradication, and bad ones included doing the opposite of what authorities tell you to do, which can be good sometimes, but not in the way that these boys were planning it. And this latter part is what got Pablo addicted to marijuana for his entire life. So their early life was in some ways very different, but they ended up at a stage where they entered the world of drugs, and they quickly fell in love with the profits it could make them. But these were only the starts of two very weird journeys. Let's see their transition from petty crimes to violent ones. Now, El Chapo's journey. Brace yourself, it's a wild one, to say the least. As we mentioned, in Sinaloa, drugs were the hit of the show. They provided food, shelter, entertainment, and of course, even sanity. El Chapo himself worked until he was 20 in the field of poppies, the same one where he was born. And people are surprised as to how he turned out to be a drug kingpin. El Chapo had a natural tendency to want luxurious things, so he decided that a farmer's life was not enough for him and that he needed to move to a city. Actually, not even a city, the city. The capital of drugs. El Chapo moved to the capital and joined a drug cartel almost immediately. But the thing is, he wasn't the only druggie in town. The city was filled to the brim with drug dealers wanting a piece of the drug world. Why did El Chapo rise so fast, while other drug dealers didn't? Well, that's simple. He didn't hesitate to kill. There was nothing and no behavior that pissed off El Chapo, and he let it go. None. You step a toe out of line, you got shot. You got bribed. You got shot by El Chapo. You miss a shipment because you were partying, you got shot. His crew was flawless because he kept eliminating anyone who made mistakes and earned a reputation of being ruthless, which may not sound good to us, but to cartel members, they had hit the jackpot. El Chapo was the golden guy, the one who brought in more profits than the rest. El Chapo became one of the highest-ranking cartel members very, very quick. Now, things would get brutal, but first, we have to come back to Pablo Escobar. We left the story with him getting involved in a movement that defied authority and got him addicted to marijuana and the promise of a lot of money. Well, at 17, Pablo dropped the makeshift cousin Cartel due to excessive boredom. He wanted to make his own way in the world. He actually opened up a bike repair shop, which earned him enough money for a bike of his own, which was the reason for opening the shop in the first place. The bike provided means of fast escape, and Pablo began his life of crime, fast enough that the police couldn't catch up for a while. First, he stole grave headstones, then stole cash from businesses and individuals. Both of these sounded kind of pathetic to him. But he realized that he was pretty good at this stealing venture, regardless of how uncool it was to steal something like headstones. Soon enough, he got his cousins to join in. And his cousins, instead of whacking him on the head and snitching to his parents, joined in with glee at the promise of money and drugs. They all became pretty good car thieves as well, until Pablo went to jail. Spoiler alert, he wasn't a better person when he got out. In fact, he only gained more knowledge about the world of crime and how to move on to bigger ventures like drug trafficking and kidnapping, almost as if the jail system failed. Back on the streets, Pablo and his cousins stole cars on a bigger scale. Soon Pablo developed a reputation for being a violent young man. If anyone owed him money, he would kidnap that person and kill them even if the ransom was paid, just to keep his reputation. But he wasn't satisfied with this awful career. In 1971, Pablo would officially become a drug dealer. But first, let's recount Pablo Escobar and El Chapo's differences. Pablo wasn't born into poverty, which meant that his incentive to maim and kill was lower. El Chapo was dirt poor and sick of it, and he knew that he couldn't be trustworthy, then he would at best be sent back to a life of servitude. That's not to say that Pablo didn't commit atrocities just to sell a few pounds of drugs, but he spared people. El Chapo didn't spare anyone. His ruthlessness came from narcissism, and it would be his end. Now back to the story. In 1971, Pablo had technically become a drug dealer, but his early prominence lies in the Marlboro Wars. Admittedly, the name of the war sounds super cool, but it really wasn't. It was just a bloody turf war for the control of Colombia's cigarette market, and Pablo played a high-stakes and high-profile role in it. He won repeatedly. Truly, Pablo's luck came after that, from Colombia's position to be the highest cocaine smuggler. Turns out he was a great, shrewd businessman. He quickly moved to grab control of this market and even had the major kingpin allegedly assassinated to become the leader. You shouldn't do that if you want to be a great business person, though. Let us tell you how cocaine is made, kids, because it's an important part of life and more so of how Pablo earned his insane amounts of profit. Let us remind you, his end was tragic, so don't start making cocaine yourself. Pablo took very cheap cocoa powder and did a highly specialized process on it that transformed it into very expensive cocaine. It's a classic business and very classy. Pablo Escobar's rise in the world of drugs isn't anything too spectacular. He didn't magically rise through ranks. He did it by crime, and it wasn't as glorious as portrayed on Narcos. He proved himself to be trustworthy, well, as much as a criminal can be and as well as straightforward. Oh, and he murdered anyone who opposed him. The three most amazing qualities, highly admired by no one except the people who mattered to him. Drug kingpins. By the mid-1980s, Pablo was already a billionaire 30 times over, as in his net worth was more than $30 billion. Truly, no one knows the real extent of his wealth because it was hidden, and he earned his money in cold, hard cash. In fact, he had to buy a private jet just so he could transfer money from the States to Colombia. By now, he looked at himself as a Robin Hood figure. He wanted not to just be a killer and a terror for the people, but a leader for them. We would call him delusional, but he did a lot of good in the community, like building infrastructure. In 1982, Escobar was elected as an alternative member of the Colombian Congress. But a justice minister exposed Escobar's methods of earning a living, and he was forced to resign. Oh, this really angered Escobar, and the justice minister was later killed. Sorry, died under mysterious but total natural circumstances. You have probably figured out by now that Pablo loved to kill people. He was responsible for thousands of deaths of politicians, journalists, and even civilians. After his failure in politics, he unleashed his fury on his enemies in an attempt to gain general amnesty for all drug barons in exchange for giving up the world of drug trafficking. He killed 3 presidential candidates and thousands of police officers. He even allegedly bombed a plane which killed more than 100 people. For all of his genius, Pablo didn't predict that the very predictable reaction that came from the public. They turned against him, and therein lay his downfall. Now, let's get a bit further and explore El Chapo's journey. He got into the marijuana business with his cousins at 15. A few years later, he used his marijuana business to strike up a working relationship with Salazar, a drug lord. He continued working for drug lords and rose from being their driver to handling their logistics. When the latest kingpin was arrested, the cartel was divided and El Chapo took control of the California and Arizona corridors. What made El Chapo's part so lucrative? Intelligence and violence. He built large air-conditioned corridors across the borders to the U.S. and broke up shipments into smaller packages, which minimized losses and potential threats. A very good innovative way he smuggled was by using cans of dried chili. Of course, none of this would have been possible without violence. He used cruelty to ensure discipline and loyalty. If you thought your boss was the devil, listen to this. El Chapo used to give a very incentivized punishment and shot anyone who showed up late. This zero-tolerance policy was actually quite effective, and his business grew to insane proportions. His cartel also became responsible for so many murders that they probably lost count as well. We have seen both these kingpins rise, but now we'll get into their fall, and it is spectacular. Well, El Chapo's fall was spectacular, but Pablo's fall was pretty standard. He surrendered to the government and was imprisoned in a prison he had built. Unsurprisingly, it came with a spa, a nightclub, and a casino. In 1992, he attempted to break out of this luxury facility when the government was considering moving him to a more standard facility. Then began the 16-month manhunt for the kingpin as his cartel broke up due to the lack of leadership. Pablo's family sought refuge, but Pablo himself was refused such a privilege. The authorities caught up with him, and a firefight ensued where Pablo and his bodyguard were killed in a very unglorious manner. El Chapo's story is a different feat. His downfall started when the Mexican government placed a bounty on his head. His face started appearing in public more and more often. Soon enough, he was captured. But 8 years inside were more than enough for El Chapo. He broke out of a top security jail, and experts say he didn't even have to organize an escape plan. He simply walked out with corrupt guards. After his next arrest, he escaped again, this time with a little more pizzazz. His accomplices burrowed a 1.5-mile tunnel that lied underneath his cell and led to a construction site. This escape came as a huge embarrassment to the president, who had failed his people again. So El Chapo's freedom was short-lived. His crimes caught up to him in 2016, where he was captured once more, but this time he was extradited to the U.S. His trial was something out of a movie. He offered nearly zero defense, and tales of his crimes came out in a very shocking manner. The trial was actually hilariously awful. At some point, a joke was made about El Chapo's tendency to escape, and everyone laughed. The actor who would play him showed up, and the real El Chapo was pretty pleased to see him. He was eyeing him from the bar. At the end, El Chapo got a life sentence in a maximum security prison. Unlike Pablo, he is alive and well, probably safer here than he would be in Sinaloa. Everyone wants to kill him there. Personally, we think El Chapo wins this battle. Do you agree with us? Why or why not? Comment below and we'll pin the best one. Make sure you like this video and share it with everyone who's familiar with the world of drugs. This was BigFactz, bringing you the best content on the planet. See you next time.